Now to Ray Ryan in the field for an exclusive interview with Professor Sonja Fritzsche in her new book.
I'm here with Sonja Fritzsche, who recently published her new book, Science Fiction Literature in East Germany. First, why did you choose science fiction to focus on?
I've always been interested in science fiction. I read it when I was young. And I love the genre because it allows me to imagine other places and think about how our world is in relation to those worlds and learn from that. And it's sort of a thought experiment in many ways. Often they're quite philosophical. And then I was interested in East Germany because it was, when I was growing up, it was the enemy. Right? It was the Cold War was still going on. And you couldn't go there. I mean, you could, but it was difficult. And just as I was finishing my undergraduate studies, the wall fell, and a whole new world opened up, new archives that had never been available before. And I thought combining the two would be a really good thing. East Germany was always the ultimate other. So I was lucky that I got to combine two of the subjects that I'm very fascinated by.
How does science fiction and East Germany work together in your book?
Science fiction is often used in countries where there's censorship and even in this country, to talk about things that are uncomfortable or are censored, but through metaphor. And so East German science fiction writers hid critiques of the government in the book. But it's important to remember that they were also communists themselves, and so they were saying East Germany is going down the wrong path. This is the path that it should be going down, and that's what they would also show in their books. And the readers learned how to read these books so they would really know what the fiction was. They read between the lines.
So how does the East and West split fit into Germany's current identity?
I think over the past 15 years, it is highly determined what people would say German identity is. Meaning, you have West Germans who still identify themselves as West Germans, even though the country's been reunified since 1990. And East Germans still identify themselves as East Germans. That is waning now, I think, as you get a new generation that is now in their 20s, in its 20s, and people who grew up in East Germany, really made careers in East Germany, are starting to retire. So it's not as focused on now the East-West conflict as, for instance, trying to integrate new immigrants and existing immigrants into the country. That has the greater focus, particularly, of course, the Turkish population, many of which are Muslims.
What were major East German influences, and how did they structure their works?
The book focuses primarily on East Germany. It does include the influence of international science fiction. Certain writers had access to libraries in the East where they could read Western science fiction that other people didn't have access to. There were fan clubs that I focus on a little bit, and they would smuggle in Western books and literally retype them, type several copies, and pass them around, because photocopiers were not easy to come by at those times in East Germany. So at the beginning of the book, where I'm talking about science fiction in the 50s and 60s, the West is, I'm talking about the West in terms of how the books wrote critique of the West. But then later on, even though there's always a critique of the West, this influence of Western science fiction, but also Russian science fiction, Czech science fiction, so international science fiction becomes more apparent in the 70s and into the 80s. And they showed some Western science fiction films too. One of the Star Trek films was shown in the 80s, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. That's a little bit about that.
Why is it important for students to understand your work?
One, I think it's important for students to understand science fiction in this particular case, the political element of science fiction, a lot of people see science fiction as this crazy escapist kind of stuff, particularly science fantasy. And in fantasy, too, these genres often are very political and critiquing the society in which they're in, whether it's a free society or not. And they help you dream ahead or dream differently than the hegemonic values or the majority, the values of the majority. I also think, I've always thought, and I study history and I study German, and I've always been fascinated by how much I can learn about the history, society, culture of a place through what I'm reading. And I learned about what their dreams were. I learned about how they thought. And I got to interview a lot of the actual people who were writing, reading, making policy. So that was fascinating.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think it's very important to continue studying the literature and cultures of just other countries in general. You can get insight into how those people think. I found often through reading German and just learning different vocabulary, that learning of new words and new ways of speaking that didn't exist in English, that I was able to think more broadly, more critically, and also I learned a lot about myself because I was German, just because I could think in two languages. And sure, they overlap in some places, but other places no.
You can find this book in the bookstore or soon at the library. I suggest you pick it up. Thank you for making it. Back to you in the studio.
Thanks, Ray.